Chapter 6. Our Minds and Others. From Hume to Vygotsky. In one of the most famous passages in all of philosophy, David Hume, in 1739, looked inside his mind in an attempt to find his self. He tried to find some enduring presence, a permanent and stable being which persists through the jumbled flow of experience. He claimed he could find no such thing. All he could find was a rapid succession of images, momentary passions, and so on. I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. These sensations or perceptions, he said, comprise him, nothing more. A person is just a bundle or collection of images and feelings, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Hume's look inside provides a good starting point for this chapter because everyone can do what he did. When we do, despite Hume's confident inventory, we surely find two things that he did not mention. First, Hume described what he found inside as a succession of sensations. But it seems more accurate to say that we find a combination of sensations present at each time. Our experience usually forms an integrated scene, a mix of visual information, sounds, a sense of where our body is, and so on. It's not one impression after another, but several at each time tied together. As time moves forward, one such combination passes into another. The second thing Hume missed is more conspicuous. When we look inside, most people find a flow of inner speech, a monologue that accompanies much of our conscious life. Sentences and phrases, exclamations, rambling commentaries, speeches we would like to give, or wish we'd given. Maybe Hume did not find this in his own case. Some people have a more prominent inner monologue than others. Perhaps Hume was one of those for whom inner speech is weak. It's possible, but I think it's more likely that Hume did encounter inner speech, but regarded it as one part of the wash of sensations, not as anything special. There are colours and shapes and emotions in there, and echoes of speech as well. Hume's inattention to inner speech may also have been guided by his overall agenda in philosophy, by the shape of the theory he wanted to defend. Hume was inspired by Isaac Newton's theories in physics, unleashed about 50 years before. Newton saw the world as made up of tiny objects ruled by laws of motion and a principle of attraction between them, also known as gravity. Hume aimed at an explanation of the same kind of the contents of the mind, and thought that he'd discovered a power of attraction between sensory impressions and ideas, a complement to Newton's attraction between physical objects. Hume wanted a science of the mind that took the form of a quasi-physics, in which ideas would behave like mental atoms. The peculiar properties of inner speech are of little relevance to this project, and the contents of Hume's personal mental stock-taking matched his philosophical goals rather well. Nearly 2 centuries after Hume, the American philosopher John Dewey, who saw the world very differently, remarked, "It is altogether likely that the ideas which Hume found in constant flux whenever he looked within himself were a succession of words silently uttered." Around the same time as Dewey's comment, a young psychologist was developing a new theory of thought and child development in the tumultuous early years of the Soviet Union. Lev Vygotsky grew up in what is now Belarus, the son of a banker. He'd just finished his student years when the 1917 Russian Revolution broke out. He worked with the Bolsheviks in local government for a time, supported Marxist ideas, and developed his psychological theories in a Marxist context. Vygotsky thought that as a child developed, progressing from simple responses to complex thought, a transition takes place through the internalization of the medium of speech. ordinary speech, saying things and hearing them, plays an organizational role in our lives. It helps us put ideas together, draw attention to things, get actions to occur in the right order. Vygotsky thought that as children acquire their spoken language, they also acquire inner speech. A child's language branches into inner and outer forms. Inner speech, for Vygotsky, is not merely an unspoken version of ordinary speech, but something with its own patterns and rhythms. This inner tool makes possible organized thought. Both physically and intellectually embedded in Soviet Russia, Vygotsky was not influential in the West. Around 1930, he suffered a personal and intellectual crisis and began revising his theories. He also found himself dealing with dangerous accusations of bourgeois elements in his work. Vygotsky died at just 37 in 1934. In 1962, an English translation of his work, Thought and Language, appeared. Vygotsky is still regarded as a bit of a fringe figure in psychology. A few prominent people working today, such as Michael Tomasello, acknowledge his influence. The first time I remember seeing Vygotsky's name was in an acknowledgement in a famous book by Tomasello. But many do not. With or without credit, the picture he sketched is becoming increasingly important as we try to understand the relations between human minds and others. Word made flesh. What is the psychological role of language, our ability to speak and hear? In particular, what is the role of all that chattering, rambling, internal speech? These questions prompt sharp divides. For some, inner speech is idle commentary, froth on the surface of the mind and not very important. For others, like Vygotsky, it is a crucially important tool. In a brief but famous comment in The Descent of Man of 1871, Charles Darwin claimed that speech, either inner or outer, is needed for complex thought. The mental powers in some early progenitor of man must have been more highly developed than in any existing ape, before even the most imperfect form of speech could have come into use. But we may confidently believe that the continued use and advancement of this power of speech would have reacted on the mind by enabling and encouraging it to carry on long trains of thought. A long and complex train of thought can no more be carried on without the aid of words, whether spoken or silent, than a long calculation without the use of figures or algebra. Initially, this view might seem inevitable, that complex thought, with its movement from premise to conclusion, step to step, must require language or something close to it. It seems that organized internal processing could not take place without it. But once we make that last statement, we're saying something that's not true. It has become clear now that very complex things go on inside other animals without the aid of speech. Remember the baboons from the previous chapter. They live in social groups with complex alliances and hierarchies. They have simple vocalizations, 3 or 4 calls, but their internal processing of what they hear is much more complicated. They can recognize each individual's calls and interpret a series of calls made by different baboons, constructing an understanding of events around them that is far more complex than anything a baboon could say. When they build these narratives, they have some means for putting ideas together which goes far beyond what they can express, using their communication system. The baboon case is especially compelling, but there are others. Recent years have seen a steady and surprising upgrading in our view of what some kinds of birds can do, especially crows, parrots, and food-storing birds like jays. Nicola Clayton and others at the University of Cambridge, through a long series of studies, have shown that birds can store food of different kinds in hundreds of distinct places to retrieve later, and can remember not only where they've put food, but what was put in each place, so the more perishable items can be retrieved before the longer-lasting ones. Vygotsky himself, back in the early 20th century, came to recognize some of this. He knew of the first glimmers of work showing complexity in animal thought. work that may have been quite disruptive to his theories. Vygotsky initially thought that the internalization of language must be essential to any sort of complex internal processing. But then he became aware of Wolfgang Köhler's work on chimps. Köhler was a German psychologist who spent 4 years working in a field station on Tenerife in the Canary Islands, around the time of World War I. On his island, he studied 9 chimpanzees and looked especially at how they gained access to food in novel situations. The chimps sometimes seemed to show insight, Köhler said. They could work through novel problems spontaneously. Most famously, they stacked boxes on top of each other and climbed up on them to reach food hanging out of reach. Köhler weakened the idea that there is a necessary link between language and complex thought. Some evidence pushes this way even in the human case. The Canadian psychologist Merlin Donald's book, Origins of the Modern Mind, published in 1991, made use of 2 natural experiments. First, he looked at evidence about the lives of deaf people in pre-literate cultures that also lacked sign language. He argued that these people lived more normal lives than we'd expect if language was essential to complex thought. Second, he used the remarkable case of a French-Canadian monk known as Brother John, who was described in a 1980 paper by André Rochelecourt and Yves Jeunet. Brother John lived normally most of the time, but was subject to occasional attacks of severe aphasia. During these episodes, he lost all use of language, both speech and comprehension, both public and internal. He remained conscious during these episodes, which sometimes occurred in a public setting, in which case he had to deal with them as inventively as possible. The paper describes one episode in which he arrived by train in a town, had one of his attacks, and had to find a hotel and order something to eat. He did this by means of gestures, including pointing at what he assumed was the right part of an illegible menu. And he did it without any internal linguistic stream to organize his thoughts and actions. If the view that language is essential for complex thought is true, Brother John should have been much less able to function than this. John would later describe these episodes as very difficult and confusing, but he did manage, and he was mentally present during them. Extreme views on both sides of the question are fading. Language is an important tool for thought, and inner speech is not mere mental acoustic froth. But it is not essential to the organization of ideas, and language is not the medium of complex thought. I said in my opening paragraphs that Hume's inventory of inner life was surprising in its neglect of inner speech. But you might have had an exactly analogous response to the comment I quoted from John Dewey. Dewey reckoned that the ideas in Hume were just a series of words silently uttered. Even if words were indeed present, was Hume wrong to say he also found heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred? Surely Dewey encountered such things in himself too. Both philosophers' catalogues seem incomplete. The role language plays in our minds might not be too different from the role Darwin sketched, though Darwin put it in too strong a form. Language provides a medium for the arrangement and manipulation of ideas. Here's an example from recent research on young children done in the laboratory of the Harvard psychologist Susan Carey. She looked at when children become able to use a logical principle called the disjunctive syllogism. Suppose you know that either A or B is true. Then you learn not A, so you should conclude B. Can children follow this rule before they have the word or in their vocabulary? For a while it was thought they could, but now it seems they need to have learned the word before they can do this sort of mental processing. If the sticker is under this cup or that cup and you learn it's not under this cup, then... It's always hard to work out the relation between cause and effect in studies of this kind, but this looks like a very Vygotskian result. What are the inner mechanisms by which all this works? How is the word made flesh? There is a great deal of uncertainty here, but one plausible model drawing on the work of several people goes like this. Ordinary speech functions both as input and as output. Hearing provides the mind with input. Our speech is an output. We both speak and hear, and we can hear what we say. Even talking to yourself out loud can be a useful way of approaching a problem. I'll now tie these familiar facts to a concept that has become increasingly important in the brain sciences: the concept of an efference copy. The word efference here means the same thing as output or action. The best way to introduce the idea is through the example of vision. When you move your head or shift your gaze, the image on your retina continually changes, but this is not perceived as a change in the objects around you. You continually compensate for your own eye movements, so when something does move in the environment, you register it. This requires that you keep track of your own decisions to act. With an efference copy mechanism, as you decide to act, sending a command of some sort to your muscles, you also send a faint image of the same command, a copy of it in a rough sense of that term, to the part of the brain that deals with visual input. This enables that part to take into account what your own motions are doing. Without using the term, I introduced the idea of efference copies back in Chapter 4, when I looked at how evolution created new kinds of loops between action and the senses. Mobile animals of many kinds have to deal with the fact that what they do affects what they sense. This creates the problem of distinguishing when a change in what is perceived is due to something important happening outside, and when it is due to the animal's own actions. As well as helping solve problems of perception, these mechanisms also have a role in the performance of complicated actions themselves. When you decide to act, efference copies can be used to tell the brain, here is how things should look given what I just did. If things don't look as expected, that might be because something in the environment has changed. But it might also be because the action you tried to perform did not come out as planned. You often need to work out whether your trying to do X resulted in your actually doing X. You know how things should feel if you push against a table, for example. If things don't feel the way you expect, that might mean the table was on rollers, but it might mean you did not succeed in pushing on the table at all. Now let's apply all this to the case of speech. Everyone wants their words to come out as planned, and speech is a very complex action. In speech, the creation of an efference copy enables you to compare your spoken words to an inner image of them. This can be used to work out whether the sounds came out right. As we say things out loud, we also register internally the sounds of what we meant to say, and we can then tell if the words came out incorrectly. Ordinary speech involves in the background a kind of internal quasi-saying and quasi-hearing. So far, this hidden side to ordinary speech is helping with the control of complex actions, but these auditory images of speech, these internal quasi-said sentences, seem to have taken on other roles as well. Once we're generating these nearly spoken sentences to check what we actually say, it's not too big a step to put together sentences that we don't intend to say, sentences and fragments of language that have a purely internal role. The forming of sentences in our auditory imagination creates a new medium, a new field of action. We can formulate sentences and experience their results. When we hear, internally, how some words hang together, we can learn something about how the corresponding ideas hang together. We can put things in order, bring possibilities together, can list and instruct and exhort. Earlier I mentioned John Dewey, who commented on Hume's omission of inner speech when he described what he found within. For Dewey, inner speech was important, but its role was largely recreational, a vehicle for storytelling. It's odd that he did not discuss other uses. This might be because Dewey was so intensely social a philosopher. He thought that most of the important things we do take place out in the open. For Vygotsky, inner speech has a role in what is now called executive control. Inner speech gives us a way of performing actions in the right order, turn off the power first, then unplug the machine, and exerting top-down control over habits and whims. Don't eat another slice. Inner speech can also be a medium of experiment. for putting ideas together to see what comes of the combination. How would things look if I could travel as fast as light? Within a terminology used by Daniel Kahneman and other psychologists, it's a means for System 2 thinking. This is a slow, deliberate style of thinking we engage in when we encounter novel situations, as opposed to the rapid System 1 thinking that makes use of habits and intuitions. System 2 thinking tries to follow proper rules of reasoning and tries to look at things from more than one side. It is ponderous but powerful. It's how we avoid temptation, if we do, and how we assess whether some novel action will actually get the job done. Inner speech seems to be an important part of System 2 thinking. It's a way of walking through the consequences of actions, a way to bring reasons to bear against temptation. Gesturing to the careening inner monologues of the novels of James Joyce, Daniel Dennett has called the outcome of this wiring in of speech a Joycean machine in our heads. But how could something as mundane as an Efference copy system give rise to something so powerful? The mere existence of bits of language floating about inside us ought not to have so many consequences. Part of the explanation may lie in the way that sentences of inner speech can be attended to. They're made available in much of the brain in something like the same way that ordinary speech is. Indeed, the similarities are so strong that it's easy for people to mistake sounds that exist only in their auditory imagination for sounds they're actually hearing. In an experiment done in 2001, people were told to listen to featureless random noise through a set of headphones, and were told that the song White Christmas might occasionally be played very quietly through the noise. They had to press a button if they were sure they'd heard the song. About a third of the subjects pressed the button at least once, but in fact the song was never played. The usual interpretation of the experiment is that the subjects in the experiment imagined the tune they were supposed to listen for and sometimes mistook their own auditory image for a genuine playing of the song. The sounds we cook up in our heads, including the sounds of words, are broadcast in our minds in something like the way that many ordinary perceptual experiences are broadcast. Once a sentence of inner speech is composed, it is exposed to the same sort of processing that would apply to a sentence we hear. A novel combination of ideas, or an exhortation to act, is thus made available for consideration. It can have the same sort of effect that an ordinary spoken sentence can have. These phenomena, including the White Christmas experiment, have informed some attempts to explain a common symptom of schizophrenia, in which people hear voices in a way that disrupts action and a sense of self. Inner speech is apparently one of a family of tools that enable complex thought in us. Another is spatial imagery, inner pictures and shapes. In landmark work from the 1970s, the British psychologists Alan Badley and Graham Hitch gave a model of working memory, a short-term store we all have for a few items of information that are being retained or worked on, usually consciously, from moment to moment. Badley and Hitch thought that working memory has three components: a phonological loop, which can play imagined sounds such as inner speech, a visuospatial sketchpad, which we use to manipulate pictures and shapes, and an executive control device that orchestrates the activities of the other two subsystems. Inner sketches and shapes are in some respects very different from inner speech, but they're also tools for complex thought, and may have similar origins in efference copy mechanisms, in this case from the ways we control hand motions and gestures. There is a lot missing from our knowledge in this area, and some major features of the picture I sketched are conjectural. The origin of inner speech and its relatives in efference copy mechanisms has not been demonstrated, but merely hypothesized. It's possible that inner speech and imagery instead have different origins. They may arise purely from the imagination itself and only coincidentally resemble products of the ancient mechanisms that make possible complex actions. Conscious experience. Inner speech and the sketches and shapes that inner language tangles with have huge effects on subjective experience. Any ordinary human has at his or her disposal a field for the performance of countless invisible actions. The echoes and commentary, the chatter and cajoling are as vivid as anything in our inner lives. You can be sitting motionless watching an unchanging scene, and your mind can be alive with this stuff, teeming with it in a great jumble. Inner speech is so subjectively prominent for many people that it can be overwhelming. The endless chatter is something people use meditation to get away from. What do these features of human thought tell us about the origins of subjective experience? In Chapter 4, I sketched a framework in which the explanation comes in two parts. First, there are basic forms of subjective experience that arise from widespread features of animal life. I take pain to be an example. The second part of the story is about the evolution of more sophisticated kinds of subjective experience, conscious experience, in a substantial sense of that term. I think that inner speech and its relatives, the tools I've discussed in this chapter, can fill out this picture. In Chapter 4, I introduced the workspace theory of consciousness, first proposed by the neurobiologist Bernard Baars. Baars tried to explain conscious thought in terms of an inner, global workspace where lots of information can be brought together. As Baars saw it, most of what happens in our brains goes on unconsciously, but a small fraction of it can be made conscious by being brought into the workspace. When this idea was first proposed in the late 1980s, it seemed too close to old views that tried to explain consciousness by finding a special place in the brain, a place where thoughts somehow acquire a subjective glow. Baars encouraged this spatial metaphor. The workspace is like center stage. I've seen people who defend the workspace idea get into difficulty as a consequence of this. What makes the workspace special? Is there a little man living there? The workspace idea did look awkward when it appeared, but Baars was onto something. And scientific work guided by this idea soon bore that out. Baars took as one of his starting points the idea that human subjective experience is integrated. Information from several different senses and from our memory is brought together to give us a sense of an overall scene that we inhabit and act in. A second-generation version of the workspace theory was defended by the French neurobiologists Stanislas Dehaene and Lionel Nakache in 2001. Dehaene and Nakache argued that conscious thought in humans has a special relation to novel situations and actions that take us outside our routines. We start to deal with a task consciously when our habits break down or can't be applied, and we have to do something new. Often, working out this new action requires putting several kinds of information together and seeing what comes of them. For Dehaene and Nakache, the function of conscious thought is to make it possible for us to do novel, deliberate actions that require us to take the big picture into account. This approach is usually called the workspace theory. But there have always been two ways of talking about it, two metaphors that people call on to describe it. Baars, Dehaene, and Nakache also talk about a kind of broadcast when describing how consciousness works. Broadcasting information throughout the brain is what makes that information conscious. Sometimes they talk as if both things are needed, a workspace and broadcasting. Baars talks like that. Other times it seems that these are two metaphors being used to help us understand a single thing. I think the metaphors are very different, though, and broadcast is not even clearly a metaphor in this context. The idea of integration by means of broadcast should be seen as a replacement for the idea of an inner workspace, not as another way of expressing the same idea. Where is the inner space? Who looks at it? These questions are not troubling when we use a model of broadcasting. From there, the next step is to see that inner speech and its relatives provide a means for broadcasting, a way it can be done. Inner speech provides one way we are able to route things through our mind in such a way that information can be assessed and used. Inner speech does not live in a little box in your brain. Inner speech is a way your brain creates a loop, intertwining the construction of thoughts and the reception of them. And when that's done, the format provided by language allows you to bring ideas together in an organized structure. I don't present this as a complete theory of inner broadcasting and its relation to conscious thought. Dehaene and other neuroscientists trace out mechanisms for the broadcast and integration of information that probably don't have anything to do with inner speech. I do think it's part of the story, though, and one of several ways in which efference copies and inner speech contribute to an explanation of the special features of human experience. Here is another. A phenomenon that has for a long time appeared to have some connection to consciousness is higher-order thought. This is thought about your own thoughts. It involves taking a step back from the current flow of your experience and formulating a thought about it. Why am I in such a bad mood? Or, I hardly noticed that car. Higher-order thought has long been seen as having a role to play in theories of subjectivity and consciousness, but it's been unclear what that role is. Some people have argued that higher-order thought is necessary for any sort of subjective experience at all. As most animals are very unlikely to have higher-order thought, the result is an extreme example of what I called a latecomer view of subjective experience. Another possibility is that higher-order thought is one of the sophisticated features of human life that has reshaped subjective experience in us, even though it did not bring experience into being. I favor a view of that kind. I'd resist the idea that higher-order thought is the essential extra step that brings us to the kind of experience seen in humans. It's one piece of that story, though it may be an especially important part. Perhaps the most vivid of all forms of conscious thought are those in which we bring attention to bear on our own thought processes, reflect on them, and experience them as our own. We can look in at our own internal states without thinking in words about them, but in the undeniable "why did I think that" or "why do I feel that way" cases of consciousness, inner speech is prominent. We often reflect on our inner states by forming inner questions, commentaries, and exhortations about them. And this is not idle or merely recreational. It can help us do things we'd not otherwise be able to do. Full circle. No one knows how old human language is. Perhaps 500,000 years old, perhaps less. And there's much debate about how it evolved from simpler forms of communication. However language arose, its appearance changed the course of human evolution. By some path that we can presently only speculate about, language was also internalized. It became part of the machinery of thought. This internalization, Vygotsky's transition, was also an important evolutionary event. It is the second great internalization discussed in this book. The first, hundreds of millions of years earlier, was described in Chapter 2. There, near the beginning of animal evolution, cells that had evolved means of sensing and signaling for use in interaction with each other and with the rest of the external environment gave these devices new roles. Cell-cell signaling was used to build multicellular animals, and within some of them, a new control device arose: the nervous system. The nervous system arose through one internalization of sensing and signaling, and the internalization of language as a tool for thinking was another. In both cases, a means of communication between organisms became a means of communication within them. These two events bookmark cognitive evolution as it has occurred to date, one near its outset and one in recent times. The recent one is not near the end of the process, but it is near the end of the process as it has run thus far. In other respects, these two internalizations have different shapes. In the evolution of the nervous system, the internalization of signaling was achieved by making the organism bigger, by expanding the boundaries of the organism to include formerly independent beings. In the internalization of language, the organism's boundaries remained unchanged, but a novel path within them was established. In Chapter 4, I looked at the evolutionary shift from a simple forward-directed flow linking the senses and action to something more tangled. In the simplest cases, there's sensory input and some kind of output. What you do depends on what you see. Even in a bacterium, a causal arrow also runs the other way. An action has a de facto effect on what is sensed later. But in animals with nervous systems, the loops connecting sensing and acting become richer and are registered by the animals themselves. Your actions continually change your relation to what's around you. That fact first appears as a problem for an animal trying to learn about the world. How can you track new events in your environment when everything you do changes how the world appears? But what begins as a problem can later become an opportunity. In 1950, the German physiologists Erich von Holst and Horst Mittelstadt introduced a framework for talking about these relationships. I used one of their terms earlier in this chapter, efference copy. I'll now outline some more of their framework. They used the term afference to refer to everything you take in through the senses. Some of what comes in is due to changes in the objects around you, that is, ex-afference, with X for outside. And some of what comes in is due to your own actions, that is, re-afference. Animals face the challenge of distinguishing between the two. Re-afference makes perception more ambiguous. If your own actions did not alter what your senses pick up, life would be easier in some ways. One way to deal with the problem is with the efference copy, mechanisms I described earlier. As you move, you send a signal to the parts of yourself that deal with perception, telling them to ignore some of what comes in. Don't worry, that's just me. Problems stem from re-afference, but so do opportunities. You can affect your own senses in useful ways. Here the aim is not to filter out an unwanted contribution to what is perceived, but instead to use your actions to feed perception. A simple example is writing something down, a note to yourself, which you'll read later. You act now, changing the environment, and later you will perceive the results of your act. This will enable you to do something at that later time that makes sense, given what you know now. To write a note and read it is to create a re-afferent loop. Rather than wanting to perceive only the things that are not due to you, finding the ex-afferent among the noise of the senses, you want what you read to be entirely due to your previous action. You want the contents of the note to be due to your acts rather than someone else's meddling, or the natural decay of the notepad. You want the loop between present action and future perception to be firm. This enables you to create a form of external memory, as was almost certainly the role of much early writing, which is full of records of goods and transactions, and perhaps also the role of some early pictures, though that is much less clear. When a written message is directed at others, it's ordinary communication. When you write something for yourself to read, there's usually an essential role for time. The goal is memory, in a broad sense, but memory of this kind is a communicative phenomenon. It is communication between your present self and a future self. Diaries and notes to self are embedded in a sender-receiver system, just like more standard kinds of communication. Back in Chapter 2, I also discussed two different roles that communication between individuals can have. Roles that map onto different views of what the first nervous systems were doing for their owners. One role is to coordinate what is perceived with what is done. This is the role exemplified by Paul Revere's lantern code. The other role is to coordinate different components of a single action, such as when a person calls the stroke in a rowboat. In that earlier chapter, I said that much of the time both of these roles are being performed at once, but it's still worth distinguishing them. That's right, but we can also now see a connection between them that was not evident in that earlier discussion. When you write something down in order to remind yourself to finish a job later, you are making a mark that your later self will sense, something you'll perceive. In that respect, it's like the sexton and Revere. But that mark was made by your present self to get your later self to do something that completes a task. In that respect, it's like the internal coordination of activities, action shaping, even though the coordination makes use of a causal loop that runs through the external world. The coordination involves making a mark that will later be sensed. Some of these useful loops run outside the skin and some run inside. Efference copies are internal messages, activity in the nervous system. When you move your head and the world seems to remain still, that is achieved by internal means. Here, an internal message is used to solve a problem that arises from the effect of action on sensing. But these internal arcs, like the external ones, can also provide opportunities and novel resources. That is how things look within the model I gave earlier for the origins of inner speech. Copies of things you plan to say can give rise to silent actions of their own, inner actions that raise possibilities, put ideas together, and exert self-control. Inner speech can feel a bit like re-afference, like the result of an action that affects your senses. But inner speech is confined inside, hence not really heard, at least when things are working as they should. If inner speech is a kind of broadcasting of information in the brain, it resembles the loop of re-afference seen when you talk aloud to yourself or write notes to yourself. But this time the loop is tighter and more confined, invisible rather than public, a field for free and silent experiment. When we see the human mind as the locus of countless loops of this kind, it gives us a different perspective on our own lives and those of other animals. This includes the cephalopods discussed in this book. Their expressive medium, colours and patterns, does not lend itself to complex loops. That's true, even setting aside the ironies associated with their alleged colour-blindness. Making skin patterns, no matter how complicated they might be, is more of a one-way street. The animal can't see its own patterns in the way a person can hear what they say. There's probably not much role for efference copies that involve skin patterns, unless some speculative theories of the role of chromatophores in skin sensing are correct. Cephalopod displays have enormous expressive power, but as long as we're looking at a single animal rather than a pair or a group, these displays are not embedded in a lot of looping feedback and perhaps could never be. The human case, an extreme case, suggests that the opportunities associated with re-afference help to drive the evolution of a more complicated mind. Cephalopods are on a different road, and this is not the only aspect of cephalopod life that circumscribes their possibilities.